liberals need to get back in touch with the universe below their necks.
Welcome to Lean to the Left, the podcast that has no intention of standing quietly by while Donald Trump runs roughshod over our democracy. Today, the Democrats are doing a lot of hand-wringing about their election loss, but they're emerging from their shock and are taking to the streets to fight back. There have been many questions emerging since the election, including such basic ones as what do Democrats really stand for, and what's a liberal, and how to get working people back into the fold. So we have with us today Spencer Critchley, a writer, political analyst, the author of Patriots of Two Nations, Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next, and the host of the podcast, Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. That's a cool name. Spencer also has a new book coming out called The Liberal Backbone, which talks about what liberals actually stand for and how they can stand up for it much more effectively. He's taking an interesting approach, posting each chapter as it's written and inviting comments and suggestions from readers. I think that's really cool. Spencer, thanks for joining us here today, my friend. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'm really glad to join you.
Thank you so much. Now, since the election, there's been a lot of consternation among Democrats about what happened. How did they so badly misconstrue the mood of the electorate? What are your thoughts about all of that?
I really feel like this election, like the 2016 election that put Hillary Clinton up against Donald Trump, and which was the one that inspired me to write my book, Patriots of Two Nations, both of them are almost perfect crises for the Democratic Party and for liberals in general. If I were going to use one word to describe what I think the real problem is with Democrats and liberals in general, that word is alienation. I think that really starting a very long time ago in the book, I argue it goes back to the Enlightenment. Liberalism became alienated from the world of the body, the world of intuition, the world of mysticism and spirituality and religion, and became very much focused in the head, in equating rationality with all of thought, all of consciousness. Now, I'm not the first to observe that. This is sometimes referred to as the disenchantment of the world that happened with the rise of science, when suddenly the world was robbed of fairies and spirits, and many people lost their religious faith because they couldn't find scientific evidence to support it. But I think that alienation has actually accelerated rapidly since World War II, and it's just gotten worse and worse among liberals, and especially among the Democratic Party, as they become more and more trapped in their heads, and they think of everything in rationalistic terms. There's nothing wrong with being rational, but if you think of everything that way, then you start to see people as concepts who are part of a theory you have, as opposed to actual living, breathing human beings. And it didn't help that after World War II, one of the effects of the wonderful prosperity, especially in the United States after World War II, and one of the great effects was that many people on the left were able to send their children to college. But as more and more people on the left got college educated, I think it exacerbated this overly intellectualized alienation. And we're really suffering from the effects now, where Democrats are trying to figure out this basic question of what do we stand for, which should not be a question, but I think it can be when you suffer from this degree of alienation.
Yeah, they are confused about what they stand for, right? What do they stand for, in your opinion?
This is what I'm answering in the book, I hope. As you mentioned, I'm posting the first draft of each chapter as I write it.
Uh-huh.
And I hope your listeners will go to dastardlycleverness.com, or they can also find me on Substack. I'm posting them on Substack as well. You can find me there as Spencer Critchley. And I'm arguing that really liberals need to get back in touch with the universe below their necks. They've become so rationalistic and they overthink things so much. They've lost track of how politics actually works, which is almost entirely emotional. It has very little to do with the rational content of what you're saying. And yet, classically, what you'll find with liberals campaigning is, and we're seeing it now, agonizing over policy details, Did we get it right on this particular policy? Did
Mm.
we message that policy correctly? No, it shouldn't have been that policy. It should have been this one. And the reason we lost was because you guys were so focused on that policy and you should have been focused on this one. And you know what? Voters actually do not care about policy. If they're actually in the business of making policy and analyzing policy, they probably care, but nobody else actually cares about policy.
Uh-huh.
They care about the effects of policy on their lives. They care about how policy makes them feel.
Right.
And the way you persuade people to vote for you is not by, in effect, giving them a PowerPoint presentation with bullet point after bullet point about your policies. You reach them in their hearts and guts at the level of emotion. And you use the ancient art of rhetoric to persuade them, which is all about poetry and emotion and very little about rationality. And I think that unfortunately, Democrats and liberals in general are going to continue to struggle with this as long as they're trapped inside this overly intellectualized, rationalistic consciousness.
You know what? I
Uh,
think you make a hell of a point because on the one hand, the Democrats are being perfectly rational, as they really try to be all the time, but their opponents are not.
no, this
The
is something
Republicans
that
are not in the least
no,
rational.
and I believe that the one reason that Republicans understand this so much better than Democrats do is that Republicans have traditionally been the party of business. People who work in business understand marketing and advertising.
Right.
And Trump is, this is another way this is a perfect crisis because Trump is nothing but marketing.
Yeah, that's right.
He's mastered a few easy techniques you can get from any marketing and sales 101 textbook at community college, and he just keeps repeating the same ones. And people who understand marketing understand that it's almost entirely emotional. There's an old classic saying in the advertising business that you sell the sizzle, not the steak. So if you're doing a commercial about, say, a steakhouse, that commercial is going to show this gorgeous steak hitting a hot cast iron pan and sizzling, and you're going to see the juices flying up, and you'll see the faces of the people anticipating the steak, and the lighting is going to be gorgeous. There's going to be nothing in there about the technical merits of the steak or the square footage of the restaurant or the availability of the parking, or because the appeal is almost entirely emotional. But Democrats come from a long tradition of people who see all of this stuff very suspiciously and often with a great deal of distaste, as if it's beneath them to descend to the levels of the emotions. And so the classic response of a Democrat to feeling like they're not getting their point across is to make it again and make it again. And the assumption is if I just explain it to them one more time, they'll finally get it. And
Right.
then a companion assumption with that is if they're not getting it, even though I've explained it so many times, I guess maybe they're just stupid. And oh boy, talk about alienation. Now, if you want to alienate voters, first of all, come across as somebody who needs to explain things to them, which strongly implies I know a lot more than you do.
Mm.
And then indicate that you think maybe they're a little too dim to fully appreciate just how
Uh,
persuasive your
So
argument
you
is.
don't think Hillary Clinton calling MAGA people deplorables was a good move?
No, that was a bit of a misstep. Now, of course, she was unfairly tagged with that, but that's the way politics works. If you analyze what she said, she was saying the awful people who support Trump, and there are awful people who support Trump, are deplorable, but that's a really stupid thing for any politician to say. In my book, by the way, the first book, Patriots of Two Nations, I talk about Max Weber, one of the really founding figures in sociology, hugely influential, who was active in the early 20th century. And he categorized different kinds of leaders. And one type of leader is charismatic,
Hmm.
and another type is, I don't think the word is bureaucratic. I'm forgetting the exact word he uses. Anyway, in categorizing various types of leaders, he identifies that some leaders operate on charisma. That would be Donald Trump.
Hmm.
And others operate on reason and facts and logic and
Hmm.
tend to come across as skilled bureaucrats or technocrats. And that would be Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And that's reason why I think that election was part of this perfect crisis in liberalism, because I, along I think with just about all Democrats, was utterly shocked that Hillary Clinton could lose to somebody like Donald Trump, who is so obviously grotesquely unfit. And that's what got me thinking about how did this happen? And that's what led me to this thesis. And it turns out in retrospect now that this is why I say Trump was inevitable. Hillary Clinton was probably the absolutely perfectly wrong candidate for that time in history against that opponent
Why do you say that?
because she's so rationalistic. On paper, she's so qualified,
Hmm.
right? She's obviously very smart. She's very highly educated.
Right.
She's built up a lot of really relevant experience. As many people have noted, she was one of the most qualified people ever to run for president on paper.
Mhm.
And I helped out on her campaign. I wasn't planning to because I thought it was so obvious she was going to win, but I got nervous and I volunteered to join the campaign late to do whatever I could to help.
Mhm.
So I saw something of the campaign from the inside as well. And I would say, here you have a candidate who looks perfect on paper and yet is a terrible political campaigner.
Mhm.
And she was terrible because she was stuck in her head and her speeches were a lot like PowerPoint presentations, one policy point after another. And when she tried to come across as one of the folks, as a regular person, she and her campaign would arrange things like having a beer in a classic working class bar in Philadelphia or somewhere. And it's just so transparently contrived. And nobody believes that Hillary Clinton hangs out in a bar having a beer with the guys, right? So all of it
I can see it
indicates
now.
this overly rationalistic, intellectualizing, theoretical remove from actual people and how you actually communicate with actual people. And this is all kinds of people. Sometimes people think this is just code for white working class rural voters, preferably male, and you need to go into those working class bars or pretend to go duck hunting or something as if this is what you do on your weekends. And what about all the other different kinds of voters? No, this applies to Black voters, Latino voters, all kinds of voters, as we've been seeing with Trump's gains among those voters as well,
Right, right, right.
because those voters as well have had this feeling of alienation from the Democratic Party, this
Mhm.
feeling that they're being seen as stereotypes and that they're being often talked down to, or people are just making basic mistakes like thinking the number one issue for all Latinos is immigration, as if they're not fully formed individual human beings who have all the same range of concerns as everybody else. And many of them do not share necessarily liberal views on immigration.
Yeah. Hey, Spencer, I want to know this. Why is it that it was a bad thing for Hillary to go pretend she hangs out in bars and drinks beers with the guys, but Trump got away with going to a McDonald's and putting on an apron and handing out a couple of hamburgers and
Yeah.
getting all this exposure? And nobody said, "Oh, this guy will never do that. That's stupid.
Yeah.
That's just all
So
fake."
Bob, this is where this gets really mind bending. And it can be enormously frustrating for liberals to try to work this through. And I've had to put a lot of work into getting to where I am, and I think I've got a pretty good perspective on it. I hope so. Logic and reason not only don't matter with Trump, but he taps into a hostility to the very idea. So you will never defeat somebody like that by pointing out the endless ways that he's inconsistent, hypocritical, self-contradictory from one moment to the next.
Mhm.
Trump is a sort of a malignant alternative to the overly rationalistic, alienated liberal worldview. And if you think about this alienation in psychological terms, it's like your ego and superego have become separated from your id in Freudian terms, or your Jungian subconscious. And the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt is very good on this subject. He wrote The Righteous Mind and other terrific books that I really recommend. He sometimes uses the image of a rider on an elephant. And the rider is the rational mind that we think of as our conscious selves. And the elephant is everything else. And the rider can try to guide the elephant, but the elephant, if it decides it wants to go somewhere else, it's going to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's the way our full consciousness really works. It's another thing Haidt will say that I often quote is that if you're going to put a number on it, emotional and unconscious influences and the activity going on in our unconscious and in our emotional selves accounts for about 99% of what's going on. And Trump is living in this kind of dream world of the unconscious, and where dream logic applies. It's as if you have to move into Alice in Wonderland and or go through the looking glass to cite the correct work by Lewis Carroll, where the Queen announces proudly that she often believed 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's Trump represents the complete not only breakdown of rationality, but a hostile assault on it. And he has much more in common with an all-powerful medieval monarch who doesn't describe reality, he creates it. He doesn't use language to describe reality the way a rationalist or a scientist would. He has contempt for that. That's the way bureaucrats think, pencil-necked accountants and scribblers and these weirdo nerds in their laboratories. Real heroic leaders create the reality they want, and they use language magically, basically, to conjure it, which overlaps with the world of the con artist that describes the essence of Donald Trump. And it's very hard to defeat this by using reason, which Democrats reflexively do. The more you do it, the more you actually annoy Trump voters. You sound exactly like what they hate.
That's
Now,
right.
I'm not saying any of this is right, but I'm saying that this is what I think the situation is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I see that all over the place on social media, especially. And I live in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, so I'm a blue dot in a sea of red. And there's this app. It's called Nextdoor. It's supposed to be just for people to find their lost dogs and hire a cleaning lady. But people sneak some political comments in there from time to time. And the ones that do, man, they are just so Trump loyal, and it does not matter. You can argue from now until the cows come home about why the price of eggs have gone up, and that it's not the fault of the president of the United States. But then when you do that, they come back and they argue that it was some other unrelated thing that and then it's always, what about this and what about that? And he did this and he did that, always diverting attention from the real question.
Yes,
And
and
that just
that
keeps
process
happening.
is endless. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So you argue that the standard left-right model of politics prevents people from understanding what's actually happening. Is that what you're talking about here, really?
Yes, this is another handicap people are laboring under. We use this single line from left to right to locate every possible political opinion. But what I argue, and I make this case in a TEDx talk I did last summer called The War of the Worldviews,
Mm-hmm.
it's much more productive to imagine people living inside different realities. You often hear people say when they're having an argument with, say, a Trump supporter, and vice versa, a Trump supporter arguing with a liberal on the left, it's like they're living in a different reality.
Yeah.
And my argument is, yeah, except that's true. They are living within a different worldview, which amounts to a different reality. And in these different worldviews, there is, between these different worldviews, there is no common ground. It's as if you come from different planets, which don't share common ground. And on those different planets, people define fundamental qualities like truth and morality according to completely different standards, or they may not even have those. They may not even share those values. And that's the challenge that we're facing. Once again, liberals will assume that if we have a rational debate, surely we can find some common ground by saying, do you agree this is true? And if this is true, do you agree this is true? And do you see, like I do, that this can't be true? And it
Right.
will proceed, hopefully, to a shared, better understanding through that process. But if somebody doesn't believe in rational debate as a way of pursuing truth, you're never going to get anywhere with a rational debate. The left-right, the single line left-right model dates from the French Revolution, that when people sat on to the left or the right of the king, depending on whether they wanted liberal reform versus preserving things the way they were. And that's where we get the idea of liberals or progressives versus conservatives on the left or the right. And so this left or single line model prevents us from understanding that on the right now, we have an anti-liberal right that left to right line assumes everybody's a liberal in the sense of liberal democracy. As you probably know, there's liberal meaning people on the left is the way we familiarly use the term, but liberalism is the philosophy on which American democracy and all modern democracies are based. It's the philosophy of individual freedom and equality and the rule of law and democratic elections, etc., that comes out of the Enlightenment. So, in that sense, traditionally, everybody who believes in American democracy is a liberal, whether they're on the libertarian or traditional values right, or the very progressive left with Bernie Sanders, etc. They're all liberals.
Right.
What a lot of people don't get is one of the most, if not the most important part of the crisis we're facing is a reaction against liberalism itself, the broad-based liberalism of liberal democracy. In the United States and across the developed democratic world, we are seeing people rejecting liberalism. And so Trumpism is the anti-liberal right. And part of what I'm working on now is making the case that what people call the woke left, meaning the woke left of speech codes and cancel culture, etc., is the anti-liberal left. And they're explicit about that. They explicitly reject liberalism
Right.
for reasons they're happy to offer. You can't locate an anti-liberal right on a single line of liberal opinion. It's not on that line at all. And
Yeah,
you
it's
can't
true.
locate the anti-liberal left on that line either. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking if you're woke, you're just on the far progressive left, like a Bernie Sanders or an AOC. No, assuming Bernie's a liberal still, he's a very progressive liberal, you're not on the same line with him at all because you reject liberalism overall. And similarly on the right, a lot of people think Trump is just far right. No, he's not on that line at all. He rejects liberalism overall. And so to conceive of what's going on, that is, I think, one of the places you need to start in order to just start to think more clearly about what's actually happening and
Yeah.
abandon tactics that are not going to work.
Okay. Now I want to switch a little bit. Are you surprised at the speed with which Trump is going after key components of our government, getting rid of perceived enemies, trying to take over other countries, getting rid of government programs intended to protect people and more?
Yes, and he keeps surprising me despite the fact, often to my great discomfort, I've been thinking about him for years now. You know, since he first appeared, since he first announced his campaign in 2015, I was just horrified that he could be a credible candidate.
I
And then,
know.
of course, I wrote this whole book
Yeah.
about this phenomenon. I'm still thinking about it and talking to people about it just about a decade later. And he keeps surprising me. He keeps doing pretty much the worst stuff that I imagined he might do. The
Hmm.
stuff where I would make the case, look, he's an authoritarian demagogue. In the worst case, here's where that goes. There's a chance he will go all the way there, meaning essentially becoming an outright gangster dictator. But I keep thinking that's what's unlikely, but that's where it goes. And it's bad enough where it is right now. I thought he disqualified himself with his campaign announcement. He disqualified himself before that with all the birther conspiracy lies, which exposed him as a
Sure.
racist demagogue who can't be trusted to tell the truth, right?
Right.
That should be disqualifying. But he keeps doing like the worst case stuff.
Yeah.
And so the end point of this is the end of democracy, that we don't have another election, or if we do, it's a sham, that
Yeah.
he doesn't leave office. If he does, he'll just be replaced by, presumably, it won't be J.D. Vance, apparently. Wonder how he's feeling about that.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
it'll be whoever Trump appoints, like like a medieval monarch. And in many ways, our democracy is already over in terms of it's not, since he won re-election back in November, it's not the same democracy we've had since the founding. It's
No, no,
already very severely damaged.
it's really true. And it seems to me that the steps that he's taking, the people that he's putting in positions of power in his cabinet and in sub-cabinet positions, that all of that is designed to weaken the government agencies, make it more possible for him to dictate what is going to happen in these government agencies because he's got people that he's put in place that will do exactly what he tells them to do no matter what, including the Justice Department. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, he's following what I think it's Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic refers to as the authoritarian playbook, and she's another great source on all of this who I enthusiastically recommend and admire. Uh, you can almost predict once if you assume he's going to do the worst possible stuff, it becomes much more predictable.
Yeah,
You attack the media, you destroy trust in the media, you convince people it's all fake news, that you can't trust anything you hear.
yeah,
You attack the institutions of democratic government, you convince people the government's their enemy. You convince them that this leader is your almost divinely, literally divinely appointed, in this case, national champion who embodies the mystical spirit of the real nation and who will, in effect, magically solve all your problems and is your only hope against the constant threats you face. This is all utterly classic. And the techniques were really perfected with the rise of mass media starting in the late 19th century, going into the 20th, with the emergence of figures like Lenin and then Mussolini and Hitler, of course. And they all recognized the power of mass media to create an artificial reality for people, an all enveloping worldview or alternate reality in which the only truth comes from the charismatic leader at the center of that reality. And it's by now it's you can almost follow it like a recipe.
yeah. What's your take on the mass media, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so on, treatment of Trump compared to the Democrats?
This is an area where I'm just shocked and really heartbroken in a case like the Washington Post,
Hmm.
for example, with Bezos withdrawing the endorsement of Kamala Harris just before the election, and he can come up with all the justifications he wants, even if he believes what he's saying. He's not an idiot. He would have to know what that looked like and how
Right.
damaging it was just because of the way it looked.
Yeah.
And then the moves since, which have led to many resignations from the Washington Post.
That's right.
And this was a truly great newspaper and truly one of the bulwarks of our democracy.
Really,
And to see that happen is heartbreaking.
it is.
It's also given the cult of a really phony, so artificial and obviously originating in people who apparently have no direct experience of what they're talking about, this cult of masculinity from people like Bezos and Zuckerberg and Musk and these folks. In the case of the Washington Post, and we keep seeing examples like this, Katharine Graham, the legendary former publisher of the Post,
Yep.
if we want to talk about manhood in traditional terms, and I think these terms are actually worth hanging on to, we could obviously do away with the bad stuff from traditional definitions of masculinity, but values like courage, integrity, using your strength to protect people who need protecting instead of bullying them. Those are traditionally masculine values that anybody can admire and that have increasingly been shown by women as they've been able to play an increasing role in the public sphere, notably Katharine Graham. So if we want to define those virtues as male, even though obviously women can display them as well, there's a woman who's way more of a man than Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, for sure.
And similarly with Liz Cheney. If you consider all the so-called tough guys in the Republican caucus in Congress who cannot fold fast enough before Trump,
I know.
they could not be more really pitiable unless they visibly wet themselves on camera.
Yeah.
And then there's Liz Cheney, who traditional definition of manhood is way more of a man than any of them.
Oh, really? She's got bigger balls than all of them.
It's and and the larger point being that to see this happening at the Washington Post, at the LA Times, to see some of the timidity of the coverage we've seen elsewhere, to see the House and the Senate abandoning their constitutional role of oversight and of managing the purse is shocking and heartbreaking for
Sure.
anybody who loves democracy.
Are you surprised at all at the reaction of the court so far to some of these things that Trump's trying to do? He's been rejected by the courts, I think, on at least, what, 4 or 5 major points on these
I
things.
think it's even more now, and thank God. So there are these islands of hope
Yeah.
amidst this sea of potential despair. And some judges have been just horrifyingly bad. Eileen Cannon, who just appears to have been running her recent career as one long audition for the Supreme Court.
Uh, yeah.
But others, including Republican appointed judges,
Yeah.
conservative judges,
Yeah.
who actually believe in the Constitution and the rule of law and democracy, have been standing up for it. And
That's
thank
right.
God. And it's not that hard.
So
This is part of,
it's our
so
only
difficult.
hope, I think.
Pardon me?
It's our only hope. The judges.
Potentially, although ultimately I don't believe a legal solution can save democracy. If we have to rely on that, then we've lost it, I would say.
Okay.
And you can't, actually, I would say that's actually a good point to raise, because I think trying to rule through legalism is also another aspect of liberal alienation. Obama actually made this point during an interview some years back, and he was giving this sort of very insightful constitutional scholar's analysis of where he thought Democrats might have gone a little bit wrong in the 60s by getting a little bit too attached to using the Supreme Court to achieve the legislative victories that they otherwise could have tried to achieve through getting laws passed in Congress.
Okay.
And if, for example, I think he was suggesting that, if I remember right, pursuing abortion rights for women, even though there's a strong argument to make based on the Constitution and on the rights of women, it might have politically been more effective and led to a more lasting, resilient change if they had campaigned on it and won at the ballot box, so that anti-abortion rights people didn't feel like they'd been rolled over by a liberal Supreme Court. Now, the right happened to take that interview. I remember having to argue this on right-wing talk radio at one point, and claimed Obama was somehow being a radical Marxist or something. And in fact, that's actually a fairly conservative argument about the use of the courts. And I think his larger point is a good one, that politically, you're in a much stronger position if you can win elections than if you have to get laws passed in order to achieve your goals. And I think that's going to require, again, getting back to Democrats relearning how to do politics, realizing it's almost all emotion and authentic connections with people, and win over people so that they back you enthusiastically and not feel like that was some pretty impressive logic and your evidence seems to check out. So I guess I'm voting for you, because that's not the way it works.
All right. I want you to tell us a little bit about Patriots of Two Nations, why Trump was inevitable. Why, I know we've talked about that some, but why do you feel he
Yeah.
was inevitable?
Yeah. As I started thinking about, as I say, I was so shocked when Hillary lost. I mentioned I was helping out on that campaign. And
Right.
during the last week, I was in Arizona helping with the Arizona campaign, because that was a swing state that she might have won. I thought I could make a difference there. So I was there doing whatever in the communications area I thought I could do to help. And on election night, communication staff was setting up the victory night party. We assumed it would be. And the Republicans of Arizona had a hotel booked across the street from the hotel we were in, and were setting up their party.
Mhm.
And as the results came in, and then Trump won Ohio, this enormous cheer went up from across the street from the
Okay.
Republicans. And we were, of course, crying and heartbroken and just
Oh, my.
utterly shocked. So that's what really led me to writing the book. I was doing media interviews during the next couple of years. I do that fairly often. And I was in the middle of a panel discussion and talking about this weird hold that Trump seems to have over so many voters.
Mhm.
And I had an instinctive sense of what was going on. And as I started to explain my thinking, it clicked in my head. And it was during that panel discussion that suddenly the idea for the book occurred to me. And the first draft of that book poured out of me in about 6 weeks. I then revised it a lot, but it just seemed so right to me. And the core argument is this complete split between the rational and the emotional, and the world of science and reason, and the much larger and often more powerful world of intuition, mysticism, emotion, religious faith, art, often, uh, sense of beauty, sense of meaning in life. And that split in American history can be traced back to the founding, when the founders of the country, led by people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and others, were inspired by the European Enlightenment, which was often described as the triumph of reason. It was called the Enlightenment because it was as if there was this dawn of reason illuminating the world for the first time after millennia of ignorance and superstition. And the founders of this country were so excited by the Enlightenment, they had the vision of founding a country based on Enlightenment reason, along with also classical values that can be traced back to Rome and the Roman Republic, and to some extent Greece. That's basically the history we get taught in public schools, not in religious schools, but in public schools, that essentially there was this triumph of reason, and it led to this enormous progress ever since, with science and the Industrial Revolution, and more wealth than the world has ever seen, and enormous advances in healthcare, and enormous advances in freedom. And all of that proceeds from the Enlightenment. And one of the crowning achievements is liberal democracy. But what a lot of people don't realize is there's a counter history of a counter Enlightenment that goes all the way back to the founding. And a great many people rejected the Enlightenment worldview, including serious thinkers, serious philosophers, who rejected it because they felt that if it's only to be reason that determines how we think and how we determine what's true, then that's creating a world in which essentially there is no soul, there are no deep, heartfelt ties of community or national identity. There's no beauty in that world because it's just rational. It's all just a matter of economics and practicality. And they didn't want to live in a world like that. And they thought it would be ultimately immoral because there is no liberalism. The philosophy of liberalism makes no claim about what's called a theory of the good. It leaves that up to every individual citizen to work out for themselves, whether they decide what's good, how to live a good life, what makes life meaningful. You get to decide that for yourself, whether you find that in a religion, whether you find it in a philosophy, or whether you conclude that you're a nihilist and life is meaningless and you're just alive and you do your best and then you die and you disappear into oblivion. Liberalism leaves that all up to the individual private citizen. And many people find that empty, terrifying in many ways. And they think it leads inevitably to immorality, because if there is no unifying standard of what we're supposed to do to live moral, good lives, then it's everybody for themselves, and society breaks down, which is a common argument on the right.
Yeah.
So I traced that history in short form, explaining how once you get that, you get a new perspective on the Civil War, which of course was primarily driven by the economics of slavery, but it was also a revolution of the counter-Enlightenment worldview that rejected the northern world of rationality and industrialization and wanted to preserve the old world of landed aristocracy and the values of the aristocracy, the gentility that was adopted by Southern slaveholders. And you see this battle between Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment worldviews throughout American history. And Trump represents that battle reaching a real historical crisis point that's comparable to the Civil War, where the counter-Enlightenment people are in revolt essentially against what they see as domination by these soulless, immoral rationalists on the left.
Okay. I want to know how it's going with your new book, The Liberal Backbone, where you're inviting people to submit comments and so on. How's that going?
It's been great so far. I've had some really excellent responses from people, including in one case from a professor of political science who I really respect, and I appreciate him taking the time to go through what I've written so far carefully and ask about some stuff I'm asserting or challenge it. And the back and forth has been very useful to me. And all of the stuff that I've gotten has been very helpful. Excellent. It's a risky thing to do, of course, for a writer, because normally, and I'm normally like this, writers write in solitude. And to open up that process to the public is to invite self-consciousness because you're aware of all of these people looking over your shoulder while you're working.
Yeah.
But I thought in this case, it would be an interesting experiment to do and a challenge to myself to just not be self-conscious. Um,
Okay.
and I also feel like I'm in a big hurry to get these ideas out,
Uh-huh.
so that the process of writing the book also becomes a process of releasing blog posts and podcast episodes for each chapter to get my thinking out as fast as I can. So that even if for some reason I never actually finish the book, I'm pretty sure I will. I'm doing whatever I can every time I publish one of these things and every time I talk about these ideas like I am right now. I'm aware, of course, that it's anything I can do is just a tiny part of what needs to be done. But like
Right.
a lot of people, I feel like whatever I can do, I absolutely must do. And so
Absolutely.
that's another reason why I'm doing it chapter by chapter like this.
That's very cool. That's very cool. When do you expect you said you if you get it done, but you will
Yeah,
get it done, right?
I will get it done. That's part
Yeah.
of it's
Do you have any
important.
idea when?
This is actually something Democrats can learn from Trump or people like him. And this is something I often would say to my clients is that your enemy is not your enemy is your teacher.
Hmm.
So learn whatever you can from whatever it is they're showing you. And Trump comes from this tradition. Another way of thinking of what he represents is the triumph of the will, as in the Leni Riefenstahl film about Hitler. But it comes from Nietzsche and goes all the way back to the Homeric era in ancient Greece, the idea that virtue is heroic virtue. And where I said earlier, he doesn't describe reality, he creates it. And he does that. The mythology of this is that he does it through sheer force of will. And
Right.
Democrats also tend to be uncomfortable with that idea.
Okay.
But it's worth realizing how powerful it is to just decide you're going to do something. So that's with this book, I've decided I'm going to finish this book. I don't actually know how it ends.
Okay.
I just know there's going to be an ending and the book is going to be done.
Okay. All right. So listen, where again, how is it that people can go online and participate in this process?
I'm new to Substack, so I like to encourage people to go to Substack and build up my small followership there. So if they go to Substack, I'm at Spencer Critchley, at sign SpencerCritchley. Thanks to my parents for that
Okay.
challenging name to spell. Or the website for the podcast is dastardlycleverness.com. So you'll
Okay.
find the chapters there as well. And if on any podcast app, Apple Podcasts or whatever, if you look for Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good, you'll find the podcast there. You
Okay.
can also find it on YouTube. So I'm really trying to cover the bases. If you go to the
Excellent.
Dastardly Cleverness in the
Excellent.
Service
Well, I'm
of
going
Good,
to take a look. Maybe I'll send some comments in.
I'd be happy to get them. Thank you. I'd appreciate it.
I love the idea. I do. I think it's just great.
I
All
didn't
right.
invent it. I stole it from Charles Dickens and the Pickwick Papers, but
Oh, there you go.
I will
Yeah, he
say
did
that
that,
without in any way comparing myself to Charles Dickens.
but I'm sure he did it online, right?
Yeah, I think he had a very slow modem, so he might have had to resort to the newspaper.
Oh, okay. Listen, thanks so much, Spencer. I appreciate you coming on with us and having this discussion. I thought it was excellent and I enjoyed it.
I
Um,
really did too, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Guys, check out his book. I'm going to put links for both of his books. I can't put a link for his new book because it's not done yet, but I'll put a link for his first book in the show notes for this episode so you guys can just click on it and go there if you want it. And I encourage you to do that. And Spencer, thanks so much. I enjoyed talking to you.
Me too. Thanks again, Bob.
Hey guys, I'm Bob Gatty, founder and host of Lean to the Left. I'm excited to share our new book, Hijack Nation, Donald Trump's Attack on America's Greatness, co-authored with political analyst and professor C.J. Waldron. In Hijack Nation, we delve into the unfolding story of America's political landscape through a series of essays from leantotheleft.net. We explore how Donald Trump's presidency has transformed American politics, challenging our values and institutions. Hijack Nation isn't just a book, it's a call to action. It invites you to reflect on what it means to be American in a divided political landscape. Together we can reclaim our nation's greatness. So get your copy of Hijacked Nation today. Visit leantotheleft.net and click on the Books tab to learn more and to order.